The people who change your life rarely arrive loudly. Rain slid down the glass walls of Caldwell Tower like silver threads melting into the city below. 48 floors above Manhattan, Ethan Caldwell stood alone in his office, staring at the storm swallowing the streets beneath him. The skyline blurred behind sheets of water. Red taillights smeared across the avenues. Thunder rolled somewhere far away, low and heavy, like a warning the city had learned to ignore. Ethan loosened his tie without looking away from the window. Another 14-hour day. Another acquisition finalized. Another room full of executives pretending to admire him while secretly fearing him. His reflection stared back from the glass. Sharp jaw. Steel gray eyes. A navy suit worth more than most people's monthly rent. At 41, Ethan Caldwell had become the exact kind of man younger versions of himself used to hate. Efficient. Untouchable. Exhausted. His phone buzzed across the marble desk. 3 missed calls from reporters. 2 from board members. 1 message from his ex-wife's attorney sitting unread beneath them all. He muted the phone again. Silence felt safer lately. Behind him, the office lights hummed softly. Clean. Cold. Perfect. Just the way investors liked it. Outside, the storm grew worse. Down on Lexington Avenue, 6 miles from the tower, Clara Bennett tightened her grip on a tray of coffee cups as the restaurant doors burst open against the wind. Rain swept inside in icy gusts, carrying the smell of wet pavement and car exhaust. Sorry, a soaked delivery driver muttered while shaking water from his jacket near the entrance. Clara smiled gently. You're okay. Careful, the floor is slippery. The driver nodded gratefully before hurrying toward the back counter. Clara bent down automatically and straightened the soaked welcome mat with one hand while balancing the tray with the other. No one noticed. Most people never did. The rooftop restaurant buzzed with Friday night conversations and expensive laughter. Crystal glasses clinked beneath warm amber lights. Men in tailored coats checked stock prices between bites of steak. Women with diamond earrings leaned close enough to whisper things they probably wouldn't remember tomorrow morning. Clara moved quietly through all of it like she belonged to another world entirely. Her black uniform sleeves were rolled neatly to her elbows. A few loose strands of honey-brown hair had escaped from her ponytail because of the humidity outside. She looked tired tonight, but her eyes still carried that same calm softness people trusted without understanding why. Table 12 asked for you again. Another waitress whispered while passing her near the kitchen. Clara smiled faintly. Thanks. I swear half this place only tips because you're nice to them. Clara glanced toward the rain outside the windows. Maybe people just need someone to be nice to them. The other waitress laughed softly. In Manhattan? Good luck with that. Clara smiled, but said nothing. She picked up the fresh coffee pot and crossed the dining room again. Near the back windows, an elderly man sat alone in a wrinkled coat beside a fogged-up pane of glass. Clara slowed when she noticed his untouched soup. Too cold? She asked gently. The man looked embarrassed. My hands are shaking too much tonight. Without hesitation, Clara crouched beside the table and quietly tore the bread into smaller pieces for him. There, she said softly. Easier this way. The old man looked at her for a long moment. You remind me of my daughter. Clara's smile faded just slightly. I hope that's a good thing. Best thing in my life. For a second, something flickered across her face. A sadness too practiced to fully hide. But then she smiled again. Calm, warm, quiet. Across the restaurant, a young businessman snapped his fingers impatiently for service. Clara stood immediately and crossed the room before anyone else could react. Sorry for the wait, she said kindly. Can I get you another bourbon? The man barely looked at her. About time. She nodded once. No anger. No resentment. Just patience that somehow survived this city every single night. Outside, rain hammered harder against the windows now. The storm had turned violent. Wind bent the trees lining the sidewalks below. Sirens echoed somewhere downtown. Clara glanced toward the glass entrance briefly. Something about storms always made her uneasy. Her mother used to say rain brought memories to the surface. Tonight, she could feel old ones pressing close already. Her shift should have ended 40 minutes ago, but one of the younger servers had gone home sick, so Clara stayed without complaining. She always stayed. Clara, the manager called from the bar area. One more VIP reservation just arrived. Table 7. She nodded automatically and grabbed another menu. But when she looked toward the entrance, her steps slowed. Ethan Caldwell walked into the restaurant surrounded by rain and silence. Even soaked from the storm, he carried himself like power had been stitched directly into his bones. Conversations lowered slightly around him. A few people recognized him immediately. Clara didn't. Not yet. She only noticed the exhaustion in his eyes before anything else. The moment Ethan Caldwell stepped inside the restaurant, the entire atmosphere shifted without anyone announcing it. Conversations softened. A bartender straightened his posture. Two junior executives near the windows exchanged quick whispers while pretending not to stare. Wealth had a strange gravity in Manhattan. People felt it before they understood it. Clara only noticed that the man standing near the entrance looked tired. Rainwater darkened the shoulders of his navy overcoat. Tiny drops slid slowly from his hair onto the polished black marble floor beneath him. For one brief second, he remained still beneath the warm amber lights, as if deciding whether he even wanted to be there. Then his eyes lifted toward the dining room. Calm, distant, unreachable. Clara approached with a menu tucked gently beneath one arm. "Good evening, sir," she said softly. "Table for one." Ethan glanced at her without recognition. Just another waitress. Another polite voice in another expensive room. "Reservation under Caldwell." Clara nodded immediately after checking the tablet near the hostess stand. "Right this way." She led him across the restaurant toward the corner table beside the rain-streaked windows. The city shimmered outside like blurred watercolor beneath the storm. Yellow taxi lights reflected against wet pavement 40 floors below. Somewhere downtown, lightning flashed behind the skyline. Ethan removed his coat, while Clara pulled out the chair slightly for him. "Can I start you with coffee tonight?" she asked. "Black." "Of course." He barely looked at her as he loosened the cuff of his watch and placed his phone on the table beside him. The screen lit up every few seconds with incoming messages he ignored immediately. Clara noticed the tension in his jaw more than the expensive watch. She had seen that expression before. People who carried too much pressure often looked colder than they truly were. Across the room, another server leaned toward Clara as she passed the kitchen entrance. "That is Ethan Caldwell," she whispered carefully. "The Ethan Caldwell." Clara blinked once. "The CEO? Worth like $8 billion. Clara glanced back toward the corner table where Ethan now stared silently out the window while rain crawled down the glass behind him. He did not look powerful in that moment, just lonely. "People still get hungry no matter how rich they are," Clara said quietly before disappearing into the kitchen. The other waitress stared after her with a confused smile. 10 minutes later, Clara returned balancing a tray with black coffee, sparkling water, and fresh bread warmed from the oven. Ethan had not touched his phone. He was still watching the storm. "Your coffee," Clara said gently while setting the cup beside him. Ethan nodded once. "Thank you." It was automatic, detached, but still polite enough to surprise her slightly. Most wealthy customers either ignored staff completely or tried too hard to appear kind. Ethan didn't either. He simply seemed exhausted by existing around people. Clara reached for the breadbasket, but paused when she noticed his hands. His fingers pressed tightly against the edge of the table. White at the knuckles. Barely controlled tension. "Long night?" she asked softly before she could stop herself. Ethan finally looked up directly at her. His gray eyes sharpened slightly, almost suspicious of the question. "Something like that." Clara gave a small, understanding nod. Rain makes everything feel heavier. For the first time that evening, Ethan looked at her for longer than 2 seconds. Most people around him filled silence immediately. Investors, reporters, lawyers, everyone always trying to impress him or convince him of something. But this waitress simply stood there calmly, like she expected nothing at all. "Do you always talk to customers like a therapist?" he asked dryly. Clara smiled faintly. "Only the ones who look like they forgot how to sleep." Ethan almost reacted, almost smiled, but it disappeared before fully reaching his face. "I sleep fine." Clara glanced once at the untouched coffee in front of him. "Then I guess the coffee is just for decoration." A quiet beat passed between them. Strange, light, human. Then Ethan's phone vibrated again across the table. His expression hardened immediately when he saw the caller ID. He declined the call without hesitation. Clara stepped back gently. "I will give you a few minutes." "Wait." The word surprised even him. Clara paused. Ethan looked toward the windows again. Rain battered the glass harder now. "What makes you think people can tell when someone is tired?" Clara folded her hands lightly in front of her apron. Because tired people stop looking at what is in front of them. Ethan frowned slightly. And what am I not looking at? Clara glanced toward the storm outside. Depends. Her eyes moved back toward him carefully. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Ethan stared at her quietly. There was no flirtation in her voice. No manipulation. Just honesty spoken softly enough that most people would miss it entirely. Somewhere near the kitchen, plates clinked against marble counters. Laughter rose from the bar area. Thunder rolled again outside the windows. But for a few seconds, the corner table felt strangely still. Then Clara noticed movement near the entrance. An elderly homeless man stood just outside the restaurant awning, soaked completely through, shivering beneath the storm while pedestrians rushed past without slowing down. Clara's expression changed immediately. Concern. Ethan followed her gaze toward the glass doors. You know him? He asked. No. She reached quietly into her apron pocket and pulled out folded cash. Probably most of her tips from the night. Excuse me for 1 second. Before Ethan could respond, Clara disappeared toward the entrance. He watched silently as she stepped outside into the freezing rain without hesitation. Wind whipped her hair loose instantly. She crossed the sidewalk quickly and handed the older man both the money and the umbrella hanging beside the hostess stand. The man looked stunned. Clara simply smiled gently and spoke a few quiet words Ethan could not hear through the glass. Then she hurried back inside, already soaked at the shoulders. Water dripped from the ends of her hair onto the floor as she closed the door behind her. The hostess looked horrified. Clara, that was your umbrella. Clara shrugged softly while brushing rainwater from her sleeves. He probably needed it more. Ethan stared at her from across the restaurant. Silent now. Completely silent. Because for the first time in a very long time, he had just watched someone give something away without wanting anything back. Rain continued to hammer against the windows long after the dinner rush should have ended. The city outside looked blurred now, softened beneath silver sheets of water and reflections from passing headlights. Inside the restaurant, warm jazz drifted quietly through hidden speakers while exhausted servers stacked menus and polished glasses for closing. But Ethan Caldwell remained at table 7 long after his untouched coffee had gone cold. He told himself it was because the storm was too severe to leave. That was easier than admitting he had not stopped thinking about the waitress who gave away her only umbrella to a stranger without hesitation. Clara moved through the nearly empty dining room, carrying a tray of dishes balanced carefully against one shoulder. Her uniform sleeves were still damp from the rain earlier, though she acted like she did not notice. Ethan watched her laugh softly at something the dishwasher said near the kitchen entrance. It was not performative laughter, not the polished kind wealthy people practiced during charity galas and networking dinners. It sounded real, small, human. He realized suddenly that he could not remember the last time he had heard anyone laugh around him without wanting something first. His phone vibrated again. Ethan glanced down at the screen. Another headline. Another article dissecting his company's falling stock price after rumors of internal corruption spread through financial media all afternoon. He locked the phone immediately. Across the room, Clara noticed the movement. You should not keep reading bad news while it is raining, she said lightly while refilling a nearby table's water glasses. Ethan looked up. Why not? Because storms already make people dramatic enough. The corner of his mouth almost moved again. Almost. Clara disappeared briefly into the kitchen and returned carrying a fresh mug of coffee. She placed it gently in front of him. This one is actually hot. Ethan glanced at it. I did not order another. I know. She nodded toward the untouched first cup. You look like someone thinking too hard. And coffee fixes that. No, Clara said softly. But warmth helps. Ethan stared at the steam rising slowly between them. Nobody around him did small things anymore. Everything in his world carried strategy. Every invitation had a motive. Every compliment expected leverage later. Even kindness came wrapped in contracts. But this woman moved through the world differently, like generosity was simply part of breathing. You always do this, he asked quietly. Clara tilted her head slightly. Do what? Take care of strangers. She thought about the question for a moment before answering. I think people stop being strangers once you notice they are hurting. Ethan looked away toward the rain-streaked glass. That answer unsettled him more than it should have. Near the bar, the manager announced final closing procedures while employees gathered coats and bags. Chairs lifted onto tables one by one. Outside, the storm only worsened. Wind howled between skyscrapers hard enough to shake the windows faintly. Clara checked the time on the clock near the kitchen. Almost midnight. She exhaled quietly. The subway would be delayed again in weather like this. Ethan noticed. You still take the subway this late? Clara nodded. Usually. Usually? She smiled faintly. Depends if Manhattan decides to flood first. Ethan glanced outside. You should call a car service. Clara laughed softly under her breath. With Waitress money? The honesty of it caught him off guard. No embarrassment. No self-pity. Just reality stated plainly. Ethan reached for his wallet instinctively. I can have my driver take you home. Clara's expression changed immediately. Not offended. Just careful. That is kind, she said gently. But I will be okay. Ethan frowned slightly. It is pouring outside. It is New York, Clara replied with a shrug. People survive worse every day. Before he could answer, thunder cracked loudly enough to rattle the windows. The lights flickered once overhead. A few employees groaned near the kitchen. Clara looked outside again, then toward the hostess stand. Empty. Her umbrella was gone now. She had given it away without a second thought earlier. Ethan noticed the realization cross her face, even though she tried to hide it immediately. You really gave away your only umbrella, he said quietly. Clara reached for a stack of folded napkins to avoid the conversation. He needed it more. What if he gets sick? She smiled faintly while folding another napkin with careful fingers. Then I get sick. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. That does not bother you. Clara paused for a second. Being cold for one night. Her eyes lifted toward him calmly. Not as much as becoming the kind of person who stops caring. The words landed harder than she intended. Ethan felt it immediately. Something uncomfortable shifting beneath years of emotional armor he had built carefully around himself. He looked away first. Outside the windows, pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas while taxis sprayed water across flooded curbs. The storm swallowed the city in gray silence. Clara grabbed her coat from the employee rack near the back hallway. It was thin, worn at the sleeves. Ethan noticed that too. How far do you live? He asked suddenly. Queens. In this weather? Clara slipped one arm into her coat. I have done worse. Ethan stood before fully thinking about it. Wait. Clara turned. He hesitated strangely. This was unfamiliar territory. He negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking, but asking a waitress to let him help somehow felt harder. At least let me call a car for you, he said finally. No strings attached. Clara studied him quietly for a moment. Rain reflected softly across her blue-gray eyes from the windows behind him. Then she smiled. Small, warm, tired. Thank you, she said gently. But sometimes people need to remember what rain feels like. Ethan did not understand the sentence completely. Not yet. But he watched her walk toward the entrance anyway. Calm steps. Quiet dignity. Like someone carrying invisible weight without asking the world to notice. The restaurant lights dimmed behind her as she pushed open the glass doors. Wind swept instantly through the room. Rain caught in her hair immediately. And for reasons Ethan could not explain, watching her disappear alone into that storm bothered him far more than the collapse of his company ever had. The rain hit Manhattan like it was trying to erase the city completely. Water rushed along the curbs in silver currents while traffic lights reflected against flooded streets like broken pieces of color. Clara Bennett pulled her thin coat tighter around herself as she stepped away from the restaurant awning and into the storm. Within seconds, cold rain soaked through the fabric at her shoulders. Wind pushed against her hard enough to make her lower her head while crossing the avenue. Behind the restaurant windows, Ethan Caldwell still stood motionless beside table 7, watching her disappear into the night. Something about it felt wrong to him. The image stayed there in his chest long after the door closed behind her. A woman with no umbrella walking alone through freezing rain after giving hers away to someone nobody else even noticed. Ethan looked down at the expensive watch on his wrist. Nearly midnight. His driver still had not arrived because traffic downtown had become impossible in the storm. Usually that would have irritated him. Tonight it barely registered. His eyes kept drifting back toward the street outside. Mr. Caldwell, the manager approached carefully near the table. Would you like us to call another car service? Ethan grabbed his coat slowly. No, he paused briefly before adding. What is the waitress's name? The manager blinked once, surprised by the question. Clara Bennett. Ethan nodded quietly. Then he walked toward the entrance without another word. Outside, cold rain struck his face immediately. Wind whipped down the avenue between skyscrapers hard enough to sting his skin. The city smelled like wet asphalt, smoke from street vendors, and distant subway steam rising through iron grates. Ethan spotted Clara nearly half a block ahead, moving carefully through the storm beneath flashing streetlights. She walked quickly but not carelessly, one hand gripping her coat, closed against the wind. Ethan frowned slightly. Why was he following her? The question irritated him immediately. He was not a sentimental man. He did not chase strangers through Manhattan rainstorms because they brought him coffee and spoke softly about kindness. Yet his feet kept moving anyway. Clara stopped briefly beneath a pharmacy awning when thunder cracked overhead again. She rubbed her hands together for warmth before noticing someone sitting against the brick wall beside the entrance. A young woman, maybe early 20s, curled tightly beneath a soaked sweatshirt while holding a little boy wrapped against her chest. The child looked half asleep from exhaustion. Clara crouched beside them immediately, without hesitation. Ethan slowed across the street beneath the glow of a traffic signal, unnoticed in the rain. "Hey," Clara said gently to the young mother. "Have you eaten tonight?" The woman looked embarrassed. "We are okay." Clara glanced toward the sleeping child. "That usually means no." Without another word, Clara opened her purse and searched through it carefully. Ethan watched her pull out folded bills one by one. Tips from her shift. Probably most of what she earned tonight. The young mother shook her head immediately. "No, you do not have to do that." "I know." Clara smiled softly while placing the money into her hand anyway. "But it is cold and he needs something warm." The little boy stirred slightly against his mother's shoulder. Clara reached up and gently pulled her own scarf free from around her neck before wrapping it carefully around the child instead. Ethan stared at the scene from across the flooded street, completely speechless. She had already given away her umbrella earlier. Now this. The woman's eyes filled instantly. "Why would you help us?" Clara looked surprised by the question itself. "Because somebody should." Simple. Quiet. Honest. Like breathing. A taxi splashed through standing water nearby, sending cold spray across the sidewalk. Clara stood again and brushed wet hair away from her face. Her hands trembled slightly from the cold now. Ethan noticed that too, but she still smiled at the child before stepping back into the storm alone. No photographs. No social media. No audience. Nobody important watching. Except him. Ethan remained frozen beneath the traffic light while rain soaked through his coat. Something uncomfortable twisted slowly inside his chest. Shame perhaps. Or recognition. He thought about the charity dinners he attended every year where wealthy executives donated millions beneath crystal chandeliers while cameras flashed around them. Entire rooms full of people desperate to appear generous. Yet this waitress with soaked shoes and a worn coat had quietly given away almost everything she had in less than 20 minutes. And she had done it like it meant nothing special at all. Ethan suddenly remembered something his father once told him decades earlier before money transformed their family into strangers living in the same house. You can measure a person by what they do when nobody benefits from seeing it. Ethan had forgotten those words for years. Until now. Across the avenue, Clara disappeared down the subway stairs near Lexington Station. Ethan reacted before fully thinking. Wait. But the sound vanished beneath thunder and traffic. She never heard him. By the time Ethan crossed the flooded street, the station entrance stood nearly empty except for rainwater running down concrete steps beneath flickering fluorescent lights. He stopped at the top of the stairs, breathing harder than he should have. Then he noticed something lying near the subway entrance wall. A small silver bracelet. Delicate. Old-fashioned. Probably broken because one side of the clasp hung loose. Ethan picked it up carefully. Tiny engraved letters curved along the inside metal. For Mom. Love, Clara. Rainwater slid slowly across the silver in his palm beneath the station lights. Ethan stared down at it quietly while trains roared somewhere deep beneath the city. Then for the first time in years, the powerful CEO who controlled billions of dollars stood completely still in the middle of Manhattan, holding something priceless that money could never buy. The storm finally weakened sometime after 2 in the morning, but Manhattan still looked bruised beneath the leftover rain. Steam rose from subway grates in pale white ribbons while puddles reflected empty traffic lights across silent intersections. Ethan Caldwell sat alone in the back of his car parked outside his penthouse building, staring down at the silver bracelet resting in his hand. For Mom. Love, Clara. The tiny engraved letters caught faint light from the dashboard. Simple words. But they stayed with him longer than headlines, business reports, or million-dollar negotiations ever did. His driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror carefully. Sir. Ethan blinked once. What? We have been parked here for 20 minutes. Ethan looked up toward the towering glass building outside his window. 43 floors of polished marble, private elevators, and silence waiting for him upstairs. Usually he preferred silence. Tonight it felt heavier somehow. He closed his hand gently around the bracelet. Drive. Home, sir. Ethan stared back toward the rain-covered streets, disappearing behind them. No, his voice sounded distant even to himself. Queens. The driver looked confused but nodded immediately. 25 minutes later, the car rolled slowly through a quieter neighborhood where old brick apartment buildings stood shoulder to shoulder beneath dim streetlights. Rainwater dripped steadily from fire escapes overhead. Small grocery stores sat dark behind metal gates. Ethan stepped out onto the sidewalk, holding the bracelet carefully inside his coat pocket. He checked the address printed on Clara's employee emergency contact file that he had asked his assistant to send during the drive. Apartment 4C. The request itself had disturbed him. He hated invading people's privacy. Yet something stronger than logic kept pulling him forward tonight. He climbed the narrow stairs slowly while old radiator pipes hissed softly through the building walls. The hallway smelled faintly like laundry detergent and old wood. When Ethan reached apartment 4C, he hesitated. What exactly was he doing? Returning a bracelet at nearly 3 in the morning to a waitress he barely knew sounded ridiculous even inside his own head. Before he could decide otherwise, voices drifted softly through the apartment door. Clara's voice. Gentle. Tired. Mom, please take the medicine first. Ethan froze without meaning to. Another weaker voice answered quietly. You should have kept your scarf tonight. Clara laughed softly under her breath. You sound exactly like me. Because you are freezing. I am fine. Silence followed briefly. Then coughing. Deep enough to tighten something uncomfortable inside Ethan's chest. Did you eat dinner? Clara asked softly. I brought soup. Did you eat? Her mother asked immediately. Clara hesitated just long enough for Ethan to notice. At work. A lie. Quiet. Protective. Ethan stared at the apartment door in complete stillness. Suddenly the soaked coat. The worn sleeves. The subway at midnight. Everything made sense in ways he had not bothered imagining before. Clara was not generous because life had been kind to her. She was generous despite life being difficult. That realization hit harder than he expected. Ethan stepped back from the door slowly. He could hear Clara moving around inside now. Cabinets opening softly. A kettle whistling faintly in the background. Ordinary sounds. Human sounds. The kind money could never manufacture. He looked down at the bracelet in his palm again, then quietly placed it beside the apartment door where she would see it in the morning. No note. No explanation. Just the bracelet. For several seconds, he remained standing there in the dim hallway listening to rain tap softly against distant windows. Then he turned and walked away silently before anyone inside could open the door. By the time Ethan returned to Manhattan, dawn had begun washing pale gray light between skyscrapers. The storm was finally ending. But something inside him had shifted during the night in ways he did not fully understand yet. Back at Caldwell Tower, floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the exhausted expression he usually hid from the world. His assistant hurried toward him carrying folders and a tablet filled with morning reports. Sir, the board moved the emergency meeting to 9:30 and several investors are threatening to pull support if the media situation worsens. Ethan removed his coat slowly. Reschedule. His assistant blinked. Sir, push everything to this afternoon. But the board is already furious. Ethan looked toward the rain still sliding quietly down the tower windows. Then they can stay furious a few more hours. The assistant stood frozen. Ethan Caldwell had not postponed a board meeting in 12 years. Ethan walked into his office and stopped beside the massive glass windows overlooking the waking city. Usually mornings began with market reports and strategic calls before sunrise. Today his eyes drifted instead toward something sitting on the edge of his desk. A framed photograph. Himself standing beside investors at a charity gala from 2 years earlier. everyone smiling perfectly for cameras beneath crystal chandeliers. Ethan stared at the image for a long moment before quietly turning the frame face down. Because suddenly all he could think about was a tiny apartment in Queens where a waitress lied about eating dinner so her sick mother would not worry. His phone buzzed again. More messages. More problems. More people wanting something from him. Ethan muted the device completely. Then he walked back toward the windows while dawn light slowly filled the office in pale, silver tones. Somewhere across the city, Clara Bennett was probably waking up exhausted, preparing for another shift, another subway ride, another day of giving pieces of herself away without expecting anything back. And for the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell realized he did not admire powerful people anymore. He admired her. By late afternoon, the storm clouds had finally broken apart above Manhattan, leaving behind pale winter sunlight reflected across wet streets and glass towers. But inside Caldwell Global Headquarters, tension still hung in the air like leftover thunder. Executives moved quickly through hallways carrying tablets and financial reports while assistants whispered beside elevators about stock declines and investor panic. Ethan Caldwell sat at the head of the boardroom table without hearing half the conversation around him. The media cycle is getting worse by the hour, one board member said sharply while tapping a stack of papers against polished wood. If we do not issue a stronger response, shareholders will assume guilt. Another executive leaned forward. We need public trust back immediately. Ethan stared absently at rainwater drying slowly against the windows 48 floors above the city. Public trust. The phrase almost sounded ironic now. Around the table sat 12 people worth a combined $20 billion, yet not one of them trusted the other completely. Everyone protected themselves first. Always. Ethan. His attorney's voice pulled him back. Are you listening? He blinked once. Continue. But his thoughts drifted again almost immediately toward Queens. Toward a dim apartment hallway. Toward a waitress who quietly gave away her scarf to a freezing child without thinking twice about it. Sir. His assistant suddenly entered the boardroom looking nervous. I apologize for interrupting, but there is a situation downstairs. Ethan frowned slightly. What kind of situation? A woman collapsed near the employee entrance during lunch traffic. Silence flickered briefly around the room before one executive sighed impatiently. Call building security. They already did, the assistant replied quietly. An ambulance is on the way. Ethan should have returned to the meeting. Normally he would have. Corporate crises mattered. Investors mattered. But something in the assistant's expression unsettled him. Who was she? Ethan asked. Nobody knows yet. Ethan stood immediately before his own mind could argue against it. 5-minute break, he said while loosening his tie. The board exchanged confused glances as he walked out without another word. Downstairs, cold wind swept through the glass lobby doors every time someone entered from the street. A small crowd had gathered near the side entrance beside the security desk. Ethan moved through them quickly until he saw a familiar coat lying against the marble floor. His heartbeat stopped for half a second. Clara Bennett sat leaning weakly against the wall while a paramedic checked her pulse. Her face looked pale beneath the fluorescent lights. Damp strands of hair clung to her cheeks. One of her hands trembled faintly from cold or exhaustion or both. Ethan crossed the lobby instantly. What happened? The paramedic glanced up. Dehydration. Fever probably. Looks like she pushed herself too hard. Clara looked embarrassed more than sick. I am okay, she whispered softly. You collapsed, the paramedic replied gently. That usually means not okay. Ethan crouched beside her before thinking about appearances or employees watching nearby. Why are you here? Clara blinked slowly, surprised to see him. Mr. Caldwell? Her voice sounded weak. Ethan noticed she still wore the same thin coat from the storm the night before. You should be in bed. Clara attempted a faint smile. I had a second job interview nearby. In this condition? Rent still exists when people get sick. The sentence hit him harder than any accusation could have. Ethan looked down and noticed a folder beside her on the floor. Resumes. Applications. A printed medical bill partially sticking out between papers. He understood immediately. Clara followed his gaze and quietly pulled the papers closer against her chest. Pride. Even now. You should go home, Ethan said carefully. I will call someone for you. No, the answer came softly but firmly. Ethan frowned. Clara. She looked up at him with tired eyes. Please do not help me because you feel bad. The words froze him completely. Around them, people continued walking through the lobby carrying coffee cups and briefcases without noticing how strangely quiet the moment had become. Ethan realized suddenly that she truly believed kindness motivated by guilt was different from real kindness. And maybe she was right. The paramedic finished checking her temperature. You need rest for at least a couple days. Clara laughed weakly under her breath. My manager would love that. Ethan stood slowly, then reached down and picked up her folder of papers before she could protest. Come with me. Clara blinked in confusion. Where? Upstairs. Mr. Caldwell, I really do not think that is appropriate. Probably not, he admitted quietly. But neither is interviewing for jobs while running a fever. Clara looked ready to argue again, but exhaustion finally won instead. 10 minutes later, she sat quietly on a leather sofa inside Ethan's private office wrapped in a heavy wool blanket his assistant had found somewhere upstairs. Steam rose from untouched tea sitting beside her, while sunset light spilled softly across the enormous windows overlooking Manhattan. Clara looked painfully out of place surrounded by marble, glass, and million-dollar artwork. Ethan noticed that too. You can stop looking at me like I am going to stain the furniture, she murmured softly. Ethan looked genuinely surprised. I was not. Clara gave him a tired smile. Most rich people do. Ethan sat across from her quietly for a moment before speaking again. You should have called out sick. And lose a shift? Clara shook her head lightly. People like me do not really get sick days. Ethan looked down at his hands. Expensive watch. Perfect cuffs. A life insulated from consequences for so long he had forgotten what survival looked like for everyone else. Clara lifted the warm tea carefully between both hands. Why are you being kind to me? She asked softly. Ethan stared at her across the quiet office while evening sunlight reflected gold against the windows behind her. The answer should have been simple, yet somehow it was not. Because the truth frightened him slightly. He was beginning to care what happened to her. And Ethan Caldwell had spent years convincing himself caring about people only made them easier to lose. Evening settled slowly across Manhattan, turning the windows of Caldwell Tower into mirrors of gold and silver light. Inside Ethan Caldwell's private office, silence stretched gently between him and Clara Bennett while the city moved endlessly below them. Clara sat wrapped in the wool blanket near the windows, her hands curled around the mug of tea that had finally gone cold. The fever still colored her cheeks faintly, though exhaustion seemed heavier than illness now. Ethan stood near the far side of the office loosening the cuffs of his shirt while pretending to organize paperwork he had not actually read once. Every few seconds his eyes drifted back toward her without permission. Clara noticed eventually. You know, she said softly, most people stop staring after they decide whether they trust someone. Ethan looked up immediately. And what if they still have not decided? Clara smiled faintly against the rim of the mug. Then they probably already care more than they wanted to. The words landed quietly between them. Ethan looked away first. Outside the glass walls of the office, helicopters blinked red across the darkening skyline, while headlights crawled through wet avenues far below like rivers of light. You should go home and rest, Ethan said after a long silence. Clara nodded slightly. I will. But neither of them moved. Something fragile had settled into the room. Not romance exactly. Something quieter. Two tired people slowly lowering walls they had carried for years. Ethan finally walked toward the small bar counter near the back of the office and poured himself water instead of whiskey for the first time in months. Clara noticed that too. You always work this late? She asked. Ethan leaned one hand against the counter. Usually later. Why? The question sounded simple. But he knew she meant more than schedules. Ethan stared down at the glass in his hand. Because if I stop moving, he admitted quietly, I start thinking. Clara watched him carefully. And that is bad. Ethan laughed once under his breath. Dry? Tired? Depends what memories decide to show up. Clara lowered her eyes gently. She understood that answer more than he expected. For a while the office remained silent except for distant city noise humming through thick glass walls. Then Ethan's assistant knocked carefully before entering. Sir, the board is demanding another meeting tonight. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Tell them tomorrow morning. They are threatening to go public if you keep delaying. Clara immediately began pushing the blanket aside. I should leave. Ethan looked toward her quickly. No, the single word came out sharper than intended. His assistant blinked in surprise. So did Clara. Ethan exhaled slowly and softened his voice. You do not have to rush. Clara studied him quietly, while his assistant awkwardly pretended not to notice the strange tension filling the office. Anything else? Ethan asked without looking away from Clara. No, sir. The assistant disappeared immediately. Once the door closed again, Clara smiled weakly. Your employees are terrified of you. Ethan rubbed a hand across his jaw tiredly. Probably smart of them. I do not think you are scary. Ethan looked genuinely unconvinced by that statement. Clara shrugged softly beneath the blanket. Lonely maybe. The honesty of it stole the air from the room for a second. Ethan stared at her in complete silence. Most people described him as intimidating, ruthless, brilliant, difficult. Nobody ever used the word lonely, because lonely implied something human still existed beneath all the armor. Ethan walked slowly toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. My father used to say emotions make people weak, he said quietly. Clara listened without interrupting. He built this company from nothing, worked every hour, trusted nobody. By the time he died, he was one of the richest men in New York. Ethan paused briefly. There were over 2,000 people at his funeral. Clara looked toward him gently. But Ethan stared out at the city lights. I do not remember anyone crying. Silence filled the office after that. Heavy, honest. Clara lowered her eyes toward the mug in her hands. My mom cries during toothpaste commercials, she admitted softly. Ethan laughed unexpectedly. A real laugh this time. Quiet, but genuine enough to surprise both of them. Clara smiled immediately at the sound. There it is, she whispered. Ethan looked back at her. What? The version of you that probably existed before all the expensive suits. Something inside his chest tightened painfully at that sentence. Because he could not remember the last time someone tried to find the person beneath his title instead of benefiting from it. Clara slowly stood from the sofa, though her balance wavered slightly from exhaustion. Ethan moved instinctively toward her. Easy. His hand touched her elbow lightly. Warm. Steady. Clara looked up at him in surprise. Neither moved away immediately. The city glowed softly around them through the windows while rainwater still clung to the glass from the storm the night before. Ethan became suddenly aware of how small her hand looked against the sleeve of his coat, how tired her eyes still were, how carefully she carried herself even when nobody expected strength from her anymore. Clara gently stepped back first. Thank you for helping me today, she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. You would have done the same for anyone. Clara smiled faintly. That is kind of the point. He looked down for a second before answering. No, his voice lowered slightly. I do not think many people would. Clara studied him for a long moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out the silver bracelet he had left outside her apartment door earlier that morning. Ethan froze immediately. You found it, she said softly. I thought it was gone forever. Ethan tried to answer casually. You dropped it at the subway station. Clara turned the bracelet slowly between her fingers while her expression softened with quiet understanding. You came all the way to Queens to return this. Ethan did not respond right away, because suddenly the truth sounded impossible even to him. A billionaire CEO, standing in a tiny apartment hallway at 3 in the morning listening to a waitress take care of her sick mother. Clara looked at him carefully, then smiled. Not teasing, not suspicious, just gentle. That was very kind of you, Ethan. Nobody called him Ethan anymore, not without wanting something attached to it. But the way she said his name sounded simple, human, real, and somehow that frightened him more than losing billions of dollars ever had. The city looked different to Ethan Caldwell after that night. Manhattan still moved at the same relentless speed. Black cars still lined the streets outside Caldwell Tower every morning. Reporters still waited near the entrance hoping for statements about the company's scandal spreading across financial media. But something inside him no longer matched the world he had built around himself. 3 days passed before he saw Clara again. 3 long days of investor calls, legal meetings, and boardroom arguments that all blurred together beneath fluorescent lights and polished marble. Yet somehow the only moments Ethan remembered clearly were small ones. Clara laughing softly into a cup of cold tea. Clara wrapping her scarf around a stranger's child. Clara saying his first name like it belonged to a human being instead of a headline. On Thursday evening, Ethan found himself standing once again inside the rooftop restaurant where they first met. Rain tapped gently against the windows tonight, softer than before. The storm had passed, but winter still lingered in the air. Clara looked surprised when she spotted him entering through the glass doors. Not impressed, not nervous, just surprised. "You came back," she said quietly while guiding him toward the same corner table beside the windows. Ethan removed his coat slowly. "Apparently." Clara smiled faintly. That sounded almost accidental. It probably was. She handed him a menu anyway. "Coffee. Black. You really should try something besides black coffee and stress." Ethan looked up at her. "You say that like it is a medical diagnosis." "I think it might be." She disappeared briefly toward the kitchen while Ethan sat beside the windows watching rain slide softly down the glass. The restaurant buzzed with low conversations and clinking silverware around him, but his attention drifted only toward Clara moving calmly through the room. He noticed things now. The way she always carried extra sugar packets for elderly customers before they asked. The way she quietly fixed crooked chairs after people stood up. The way she never walked past someone unhappy without noticing. Small things. Invisible things. The kind powerful people usually overlooked because they were too busy being important. Clara returned with coffee and set the mug carefully in front of him. "Long day?" she asked. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You ever feel tired of people pretending?" Clara leaned lightly against the edge of the table. "Every day." Ethan looked surprised by the answer. Clara shrugged gently. "Some people pretend to be happy. Some pretend to be strong. Some pretend money fixes loneliness." Her eyes lifted toward him carefully. "Everyone is hiding something." Ethan stared into the steam rising from the coffee. "And what are you hiding?" Clara smiled softly. "Right now?" She glanced toward the kitchen. "That my feet hurt." Ethan laughed quietly before he could stop himself. Clara smiled immediately at the sound again, like she enjoyed watching him remember how. Before Ethan could answer, raised voices suddenly broke across the restaurant near the front entrance. A man in an expensive gray coat stood arguing sharply with the hostess while rain dripped from his umbrella onto the floor. "I made a reservation 2 weeks ago," he snapped loudly. "Do you understand how much money I spend here?" The young hostess looked flustered. "Sir, I apologize, but there was an error in the system, and we are completely full tonight." "That is not my problem." Several customers turned uncomfortably toward the scene. Ethan recognized the man immediately. Richard Vance, one of Caldwell Global's largest investors. Ruthless, entitled, the type of man Ethan used to respect. Clara moved toward the entrance before anyone else could respond. Calm steps, quiet voice. "Good evening, sir," she said gently. "Would you mind giving us a few minutes to fix this?" Richard scoffed impatiently. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" "Someone trying to help." The simplicity of her answer only irritated him more. "Then help faster." Ethan watched closely from his table while the restaurant grew tense around them. Clara never raised her voice, never lost composure. She simply looked toward the crowded dining room for a moment before noticing an older couple quietly finishing dessert near the windows. Clara walked over to them softly. Ethan could not hear every word, but he watched the couple smile warmly before standing and gathering their coats. A few seconds later, Clara guided Richard Vance toward the newly available table. "Your dinner tonight will be complimentary for the inconvenience," she said politely. Richard barely acknowledged her. Finally, Clara nodded once and walked away calmly while the restaurant slowly relaxed again. Ethan stared after her in silence. "You know who that man is?" he asked when she returned. Clara glanced toward Richard briefly. "A customer having a bad day." Ethan almost smiled. "That is one way to describe him." Clara folded her hands lightly in front of her apron. "Angry people usually want the same thing as everyone else." "What is that?" "To feel important to somebody." Ethan looked down at the coffee in front of him. The answer hit too close to home. Across the restaurant, Richard Vance suddenly recognized Ethan sitting near the windows and immediately approached with forced confidence. "Ethan," he said loudly while straightening his coat. "There you are. I have been trying to reach you for days." Ethan's expression hardened automatically. "I noticed." Richard lowered his voice slightly. "The board is losing patience. Investors are nervous." He glanced dismissively toward Clara beside the table. "Can we discuss this privately?" Ethan looked at Clara for one brief second before answering. "No." Richard blinked in surprise. Ethan rarely contradicted people publicly. "Excuse me." Ethan sat back slowly in his chair. "If you want to talk business, schedule a meeting tomorrow." Richard frowned. "This is serious." "So is basic respect," Ethan replied calmly. Silence spread across the nearby tables. Richard looked confused for half a second. Ethan himself almost looked confused by his own words. Clara remained completely still beside them, though her eyes softened slightly. Richard forced an awkward laugh. Fine. Tomorrow morning, then. He walked away stiffly toward his table without another word. Ethan stared quietly out the rain-covered windows afterward. His pulse felt strangely steady. Clara tilted her head gently. That did not sound like the Ethan Caldwell everyone talks about on television. Ethan looked up at her slowly. Maybe they never actually knew him. And for the first time in years, he realized he might finally be telling the truth. Winter softened slowly into early spring across Manhattan. The rain still came often, but it no longer felt heavy to Ethan Caldwell the way it once had. Some mornings, he found himself standing beside the windows of Caldwell Tower, watching water slide quietly down the glass, with something dangerously close to peace inside his chest. The company's scandal eventually faded from headlines after months of investigations and restructuring. Several board members resigned. Investors calmed down. Reporters moved on to newer disasters. But the biggest change inside Ethan's life never appeared in financial magazines or business interviews. It happened quietly, one small decision at a time. He stopped missing dinners with himself, stopped sleeping inside the office 3 nights a week, stopped pretending exhaustion was ambition. And somehow, without announcing it to anyone, he started becoming a man Clara Bennett would not look disappointed standing beside. One rainy Thursday evening, nearly 4 months after the storm that first brought them together, Ethan stepped out of a black town car near a quiet corner street in Queens carrying 2 paper coffee cups beneath his coat. Rain drizzled softly against the sidewalks while warm yellow lights glowed through nearby apartment windows. He crossed the street carefully and stopped in front of a small storefront tucked between a laundromat and an old bookstore. The sign above the windows read the blue umbrella in soft navy lettering. Warm light spilled through the glass onto the wet sidewalk outside. Ethan stood there for a second, simply looking at it. The little cafe smelled like cinnamon, espresso, and fresh bread the moment he stepped inside. Soft jazz played quietly somewhere near the counter, while rain tapped gently against the windows. A few customers sat reading books beneath hanging lights wrapped in tiny gold bulbs. The entire place felt calm in a way Manhattan rarely allowed. Behind the counter, Clara looked up from arranging pastries and immediately smiled. Not surprised anymore, just happy. Ethan still had not fully learned how to survive that smile. "You are late," she said softly. Ethan handed her one of the coffee cups. "Your fault." Clara raised an eyebrow while taking the cup. "How exactly is your bad time management my fault? You recommended sleeping more." Clara laughed quietly under her breath. Ethan loved that sound now. More than boardroom applause. More than investor praise. More than silence. He removed his coat slowly while glancing around the cafe again. "Busy tonight?" Clara nodded proudly. "People like warm places when it rains." Ethan looked toward the front windows where droplets slid slowly beneath streetlights outside. "I know the feeling." Clara studied him gently for a moment. There was less tension in him now, less steel. The sharp edges around his eyes had softened over the months. Sometimes she caught him smiling at strangers without realizing it. Sometimes she caught him holding doors open for people automatically. Tiny changes. Quiet ones. But real. "Your mother doing better?" Ethan asked. Clara's expression warmed instantly. "Much." She glanced toward the framed photograph near the register where her mother sat wrapped in a blanket, holding a mug of tea inside the cafe during opening week. "She still cries every time she sees customers." Ethan smiled softly. "Toothpaste commercials and coffee shops. Consistent woman." Clara laughed again before stepping around the counter. "Come here." Ethan followed her toward the back corner of the cafe, where a small table sat beside the rain-covered windows. On the wall nearby hung an old navy umbrella framed beneath glass. The same one Clara had given away during the storm months earlier. Ethan stared at it quietly. "You framed it." Clara nodded once. "It reminded me something important happened that night." Ethan looked toward her carefully. "What?" Clara folded her arms lightly against her sweater. "I met someone who forgot kindness still existed." Silence settled softly between them while rain whispered against the windows outside. Ethan glanced down at the coffee cup warming his hands. "You know," he admitted quietly, "I spent years believing people only stayed around because of money." Clara sat across from him slowly. "A lot of people probably did. Ethan nodded once. Honest answer. No pretending. Then you showed up and ruined my entire philosophy. Clara smiled faintly. You are welcome. Ethan laughed softly under his breath before growing quiet again. I used to think power meant never needing anyone. His eyes lifted toward hers carefully. Turns out that is just another way of being alone. Clara looked at him for a long moment. The rain outside blurred passing headlights into silver streaks against the glass, while warm cafe lights reflected softly around them. You were never as cold as you wanted people to believe, she said gently. Ethan leaned back slightly. You figured that out pretty fast. Clara shrugged. Kind people usually recognize lonely people. The sentence settled deep inside him. Because for the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell realized he no longer felt lonely sitting in silence. Not here. Not with her. Near the counter, the front door opened as cold rain swept briefly into the cafe. A soaked teenage delivery driver stepped inside, looking exhausted from work. Clara stood immediately. 1 second. She disappeared toward the counter and returned moments later carrying a warm sandwich wrapped in paper. You forgot to eat again, Tyler. She scolded gently while handing it to him. The teenager looked embarrassed. I can pay tomorrow. I know. She smiled softly. Go home before you catch pneumonia. Ethan watched the interaction quietly from the table near the windows. Clara returned afterward and caught his expression immediately. What? She asked. Ethan shook his head slowly. Nothing. But his eyes drifted once more toward the framed umbrella on the wall, toward the woman sitting across from him, toward the small cafe filled with warmth instead of performance. Then Ethan Caldwell smiled quietly to himself, because somewhere between the storm and the silence afterward, a waitress with tired eyes and endless kindness had changed his life without ever asking him for anything in return. And outside the windows, rain continued falling softly across New York, while two people who once felt completely alone sat together in the warm light listening to it.